Welcome, everyone, to a continuation of the Atlas Speaker Series that's also a collaboration with the Scriptalab of the University Libraries. The Atlas Speaker Series is made possible by a generous donation by Idit Harrell Caperton and Anit Harrell. But what's distinct about this particular series is that not only is this the Atlas Speaker Series, but it's also part of the Scriptalab Lecture Series, where we bring in people to talk about issues of materiality and immateriality in text, media, and culture. Now, Scriptalab, while it's placed in the university libraries, could not happen without the help of our very, very generous sponsors and supporters. Atlas among them, the Friends of the Libraries, the Center for Humanities and Arts, the English Department, the Book Arts League, and the Colorado Calligraphers Guild. Please join me in thanking all of our supporters. And so without further ado, please let me introduce our speaker, who needs little in the way of introduction since you all came. Internationally known book artist and critic, Johanna Drucker will be talking to us today about some questions with digital paratextual apparatuses.
So this is kind of a totally nerdy talk, so I don't know that it's going to be so terribly compellingly interesting to all of you, but just to say at the beginning, so if you need a nap, you know, it's okay. I don't mind. And but it actually, the information goes in better if you're in sleep state. But what I'm going to talk about actually is the desire to design some kind of digital paratextual apparatus, and some of the projects I've been involved with over the last 10 years to try to think about that, and projects that succeeded in some ways and failed in others, and then sort of where my thinking is at the moment. And of course, to get into digital paratextual apparatus, you have to start with the book and its textual apparatus. So you pick up sort of any old book, and this is as good an example as any. So anything, it's like, it's a classic. And so you figure, okay, you know how a book works. You know, you pick it up, you start at the beginning, you've got a title page, you know what to expect from a title page, and you turn the page, and there's actually a first table of contents, and then you've got a second table of contents that gives you all this information, and you think, okay, I know what a table of contents is, and I know how to move through a book. A table of contents, well, what is that exactly? Well, it's kind of like the book in a really short version, so that I can kind of see what's in it. It's kind of a preview of the book in miniature, right? And so I know what that is, and then I can start reading, and I know how to read this because it sits on the page in a certain way. So all these conventions that are very familiar, and you start, working through. You just take it totally for granted. It's like, oh yeah, I can find my way, and I know how to turn the page, and I know how to read these things at the bottom of the page, and so on and so forth. So that's all paratext, right? The table of contents is actually a paratext. What do we mean by a paratext? It's part of the apparatus of the book that actually is outside of the text itself. The actual text of the book is this. And we know up until the Middle Ages, and up until the beginning of print, really, we didn't have title pages. And even in the first, couple decades of print, we didn't have title pages. They're a waste of paper. They certainly were a big waste of vellum. You're not going to use a whole sheet of vellum for a title page. You're going to say, incipit, here begins. All right, but we developed this paratextual apparatus, and for some peculiar reason, and it's, and this actually isn't the book that got me fascinated. The book that got me fascinated is a completely, sort of esoteric book about, it's called A Picture of Poesis, and it's about humanistic theories of painting in the Renaissance. I just got fascinated with paratexts as a young person, as a kind of, pre-adolescent. I'm sure it was some kind of hormonal thing. And, just thinking about, what are all these things? It's so cool. We got all those notes and those little tiny notes and those little tiny numbers that point to the little tiny numbers on the little tiny notes. And it's a kind of fascination with that, a kind of weird fetishization for me of the paratext. You go through this. This particular book has an elaborate bibliography at the end, and then it has a wonderful index. And it's again, what are these things? How do they work? And paratexts are fascinating. They're summaries of a book according to various kinds of systems. I know a creative writer who has done a whole book just of indices. It's like, what are indices? And what do indices tell you? And they're fascinating, right? They're classification systems. They're kind of mini versions of books in a certain way. But if you've ever done an index, you start to see it's a pretty complicated business. What are the concepts that matter? And how do they matter? And what's the organization of them? But my point here simply is that, so the Plague of Lust does, has proper names and has Greek words, and it has an index of subjects so that you can begin to kind of find your way into and out of the book in this way. Now, in a print environment, to do this requires a fair amount of tedious labor. You have to put an index together by going through a book systematically and pulling out the keywords that you think matter, underlining all of the proper names, keeping a whole bunch of 3x5 cards. Anybody know what a 3x5 card is? Okay, keeping 3x5 cards and listing all these things. So it's, it's the obsessive compulsive, favorite thing to do. But basically, it's an enormous amount of very tedious labor. None of this was automated. And in fact, when digital humanities began with the work of Robert Busa, who was a Jesuit brother, he began because he wanted to do a concordance of the work of Thomas Aquinas, all right, one of the major figures of Christian thought. He wants to do a concordance, and he realized that the work of doing a concordance, of tracing every instance of certain key words across the corpus of a major writer, was something that could be automated because you could do a string search. So, big revelation, computers can do things to generate certain kinds of paratexts automatically that are really tedious to do in human labor. So it turned out, human beings who are scholars could have a dialogue with a computer, and computational systems could be engaged to do things that were very beneficial to scholarship and very useful, but they were limited. There were things that computers were really, really, really good at. They could search for things, they could match things, they could sort things, and they were really, really bad at other things. They were very bad at making interpretations. So you might know the name of a character and be able to trace through a passage in a literary work that the she had as its antecedent a particular figure, but a computer could not do that. It was really difficult in a computational environment for anything that had to do with inference to actually be structured into a computational search. So for, poor Robert Busa doing his concordance, it's fine if he's using specific words, but if he wants to use cognate words or related words or associated concepts, it's very difficult to automate. So what happened as a result is that we started to have a thing called markup language, in which you have a way to actually put little brackets around concepts that actually are used to identify words and put them into some kind of classification system, and that's what we call marked data, structured data in TEI or XML. So all this starts to be automated and allow us to work with texts in all kinds of structured ways. This, in fact, is the book that originally induced my fetishism about the paratextual apparatus. This book is a reprint of an Art Bulletin article. It's about this big as a book, and so the type in the footnotes is about 4-point type. Do you know how big 4-point type is? Okay, 4-point type is what you scrape out from under your fingernails at the end of the day, okay? So it's not readable, actually. Anyway, so I'm fascinated by bibliographical texts and what they do and how they function, and I'm not the only person who's fascinated by these things. They serve all kinds of purposes. We talked a little bit last night, for those of you who were at last night's lecture, about the way in which format and book structures actually organize communities of practice and interpretation and so forth. But what fascinates me about the paratext, and the reason I got interested in this in terms of digital activity, is what is the interpretive function? How does interpretation work? How do we structure interpretation in a digital environment as a set of paratexts? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch very briefly now on a couple of issues that come out of looking at paratext in a print environment. And then I'm going to show you the project that we did at Spec Lab called Ivanhoe that was a first attempt to actually make an environment for collaborative work for doing interpretation. Then I'm going to show you sketches for a project that I call Interpret that I designed as an extension. I called it Ivanhoe 2.0. And then I'm going to show you one little glimpse of something I'm working on myself that's a private writing project that isn't actually at all involved in collaboration. In fact, it's anti-collaboration. It's actually like, don't mess with my text kind of writing. All right, so, because this whole sharing thing is fine for certain kinds of projects, but, let's get real. There's other kind of projects where it's like, butt out, this is mine. All right, so anyway, but you still might want to have a paratext. In other words, you might want to write all the footnotes yourself and reference only your own works and do an entire discussion of, me about me and all of the iterations that I can possibly muster. I'm not an egomaniac, but I'm just mentioning, okay, that's something a person might want to do. All right, so if a person were me. Okay, which I happen to be. All right, so anyway, the communities of interpretation and the structures of paratext, if we look at a page of the Talmud, we see how highly organized and articulated those page spaces are. This particular format, the one that we know of, the modern Talmud, came into being actually in Venice in the end of the 15th century through the work of Daniel Bomberg and the Venetian printers, and who actually organized that 4 lines at the top left being the place that Rashi, the great 13th century rabbi, actually occupies in all of these interpretations. And then the hierarchy, like who gets to sit next to whom on the page, is extremely important. So all of this structured apparatus really has meaning and value in the structure that we look at in graphical form. So this raises a question as we move into a digital environment: to what extent are we going to orchestrate social relations of interpretation, put a status hierarchy, or going to use that graphical space to actually express something that has to do with, who's the most important interpreter of this, who was first, who was second, are we going to actually make a score out of this, how are we going to use that graphical space? So if we think about this conceptually, we think about the paratext. I go back here for a moment. You know how to read this. You know how it works. You know what the meaning of those different places on the page is. You don't have any question what's a footnote and what's a regular text, right? Okay. And you think, yeah, why is she talking about this? Everybody knows how to do that. But again, there are conventions that allow us to do this that are not yet formulated in an electronic environment. So one of the questions is, what are those conventions going to look like? And what can we learn from looking at books to figure out how to organize some of those conventions? So what do I mean by looking at books? Well, if we take a look at a complex page structure, we might imagine that the format features here can be copied, all right? And if you were trained in classic graphic design, you know that a lot of the work that you did if you were doing book design, or if you're doing catalog design or magazine design, was to figure out what is the right and harmonious disposition of text upon the page. That is, unless you were raised in the 80s and 90s, in which case you were trying to make the least harmonious and the most disruptive and illegible disposition of text upon the page. Okay, but now we've kind of grown out of that phase, and we're back into something in between. But the point is that what we did to do that was to copy the organization of format features, to think about harmony and proportion and color and texture and of type and so forth. And so we came to believe in many ways, or we came to sort of work with the notion that what we were looking at was a structure, a fixed structure, a graphic organization that was a thing. Now, this idea of thingness, the idea that we have a structure that we can use to organize knowledge, is something that itself has a long history. It goes back into what we call the memory theaters. And the memory theaters were structures that orators would imagine in order to organize their rhetorical delivery of, a long argument or a speech. And a very famous historian of memory theaters, Frances Yates, did a whole study of memory theaters. You look at Ken Gio's memory theater, and she looked at the way, she speculated upon the ways in which the memory theaters worked. And they worked essentially, if you can imagine, taking all of your, do you know where your socks are? Okay, do you know where your underwear is? Do you know where your t-shirts are in your drawers and in your closets? don't worry, I'm not going to ask you specifics, but if you think about how you know the spaces of your own environment and how you can dispose things within them so you can find them again, that's essentially what Yates says was the way that memory theaters worked. So if you want to get dressed in the morning and you need a pair of socks, and you need some underwear, and you need a t-shirt, and you need this, you go in and you pick those things out because they're classification systems, they are content modeling of your clothing, right? So she says you're doing the same thing with rhetoric. And so we have this structure and organization. I can stand here, take everything I'm going to say, lay it around the room, and when I come in, I can pick it up out of the room and speak it. Along comes a woman named Mary Carruthers then, a good deal later, 30 years later, who's also a medieval historian, and she writes an amazing book called The Craft of Thought from a cognitive studies perspective, and she says Frances Yates's understanding of memory theaters was incorrect. That in fact people did not, in order to perform oratory, upload a structure into their mind that they held in mind as a fixed form. Instead, what they did was that they imagined themselves walking through an organized structure and taking the cues for their performance through the encounter with every point along the way of their path. The difference would be the difference between trying to get from here to your house by putting in your mind the idea that you have a map that you're looking at from a bird's eye view, and at every corner that you come to thinking about how to orient yourself according to that map, versus moving through the landscape, and at the point where you get to the familiar gas station where you know you turn right, you go, oh, I'm at the gas station, I turn right here. You don't even have to think about it, because cognitively what happens is you are, cued in to do that. You get a prompt. So she said, so Carruthers, looking at memory theaters, said this is the way that memory theaters worked. They worked the way that cathedrals worked to prompt moments in the liturgy and in ritual practice and so forth. Why is this important? Because if we're going to look at digital paratexts in relationship to print paratexts, we have to understand what is the assumption that we're making about how these things function. Do they just function because of how they look? Are they just a structure that organizes, sets of boxes into which you put things? I'll put the footnotes at the bottom, I'll put the page numbers at the top. Or are they actually cues that tell us how to do stuff? They are provocations for action. They're provocations for performance. So I'm on the Carruthers side. They're provocations for performance. Very few people have looked at books in that particular way, to think about books as dynamic spaces that are instructions for reading, that a book is actually a set of instructions for how to read it. It encodes those instructions. You have only to look at a book that actually is stripped of those instructions, like Kenny Goldsmith's Day, where he took an entire day's New York Times and typed in OCR'd it and stripped out all of the graphical information from those pages, and you're presented with a gray text. And so basically the stock quotations are the same size as the headlines. So a lot of the information according to which you cognitively process what you're reading is stripped away. It becomes a very difficult task. It's an interesting task. The Sweets Catalog Design Progress by Lundberg Holmes was actually a study of a catalog, was an industrial catalog. But in the course of doing this particular work, these two mid-20th century designers came up with an analysis of the flow of information in catalogs that is very useful, I think, for thinking about the way in which information flows in book forms. And they analyzed their catalogs as if they were traffic flows, and said they're flows of information and that there are circuits and relations, as well as different kinds of content types that can be marked graphically so that our reading is organized according to those graphical cues. So they, I think, are also useful as we're thinking about how do we design digital environments. So if we take our inventory of paratexts and we take our understanding of how a book works according to a cognitive model as well as a design model that's based on flows and circuits, then we begin to have a way to think about how to design interpretation in a digital environment. Another couple of concepts I want to put into play, now that I've sort of said to you, oh, we have to think in terms of cognitive activity, the performance of a text, rather than a static object, is to think about a couple of different models of the way in which we do combinatoric work, the way that we think about the graphical arrangement and the relations that are sustained by different kinds of graphical organizations. And I'm just going to show you two opposing, sort of slightly different, not really opposed, but two different notions, two different graphical forms that embody different kinds of procedures that can be performed on bodies of knowledge. One comes out of the work of Raymond Lull, and it's combinatoric. Okay, so these are Lull's Volvels. This is Lull's whole system of, Ars Combinatoria, in which the meditation on the greatness of God and infinite goodness can be, performed as a way to access knowledge and insight through infinitely combining the different categories that are arranged around these wheels. And Lull had a series of wheels that could be rotated so that this meditation could be performed ad infinitum. This becomes the basis of Athanasius Kircher's Ars Magna Siendi, and he uses a Lullian system in order to do these, infinite numbers of combinatoric permutations. Right? What are the many different ways in which any piece of knowledge can talk to any other piece of knowledge in a total system? All right, so that's combinatoric approaches are one way to think about how we can automate knowledge systems in a kind of paratextual way. And another way to think about them is to think in hierarchical terms. So the combinatoric has one kind of graphical structure that enables certain kinds of procedures, and the hierarchical has another graphical organization that structures in semantic value by the hierarchy. So it says this is a category that's enclosing this category. This is a detail, this is a sub-detail, and these things across categories exist at similar levels in relationship to large concepts. So if you're in place number 3, whether you're in the animal kingdom or the vegetable kingdom, the 3-ness of that spot in the hierarchy is significant in relationship to 2 and 1 and so forth. So again, these structures all carry semantic value in terms of organizing knowledge. And again, they're part of the paratextual apparatus that we inherit in thinking about how to manipulate and play with knowledge forms. The last of the couple of slides I want to show you in this preliminary, and then I'll move into Ivanhoe and interpret, is again to think about the table of contents. We think we know what a table of contents is. It's a preview for the book that's coming. It seems to be the first thing in the book. It seems, after the title and the half title and the copyright page and so forth, it's sort of the first thing in the book. It seems to announce the book. It's a fiction. It's a total fiction. Anybody here ever write a book? Did you write the table of contents first? Of course you did. And how many times did it change in the course of the time that you wrote the book? Many, many times. All right. A table of contents is actually a rhetorical device. It is an argument. It is not just a preview of the book. It's a persuasion to tell you what the book is going to offer you. This title page from Brad Freeman's MuseLink actually records that process. He wrote the initial table of contents, and then he started to work on the book. He kept crossing it out. He kept adding things in. He kept putting in new signatures. He kept reorganizing the book itself. And then he took a photograph of that and printed it on top of a halftone screen with a bunch of other printing stuff to again expose this whole process. And it's like, yes, the table of contents is a fiction. Nonetheless, a table of contents, in addition to being a rhetorical device, is also a navigational device. And here I show you some early little leather tabs that were used for the navigation of discontinuous reading so that you could move in and out and find your way in different places in the book. Table of contents is, in a sense, a kind of set of tabs that say, go to page X. It's a way to navigate the contents of the book. So in a sense, it works like these tabs. And of course, we see artists working with this kind of tab structure. This is the Mayakovsky, produced by Elizitsky for The Voice of 1923, in which he used a tab structure, like a little address book, to segment the sections of the book and allow you immediate access into it. So it's a navigation device as well as a content model of what's in the book. Okay, so with that sort of, set of ideas in play, paratexts, ways of organizing knowledge, cues for reading, and ways of working our way through a book text, let's think for a moment just about what are the differences between what happens in an analog environment and what happens in a digital environment, and ways in which we can think about what a book is and a paratext is in terms of functions: presentation, representation, navigation, reference, and social network. I mentioned these yesterday. Presentation, what there is. Representation, what's not there but's referred to, the production of the text. Navigation, finding your way, reference, all those materials and bibliography. Social network, the footnotes, the commentary, the marginalia. Okay, so these are the functionalities supported by the book and its paratexts. In an analog environment, these things are relatively stable. There's a set of illusions, there's bounded frames, there's notes, sources, and a fairly slow refresh rate. In a digital environment, we have a reinscribable presentational substrate. We have, representation that's, anchored but filled with associations. Navigation. Navigation is probably the hardest thing to deal with. When you're navigating in a web environment to do scholarship, where are the boundaries? Where are the frames? So the unbounded, unframed, trail is really difficult to organize and navigate and, create a form for. Reference works as links instead of notes and sources, and we have a real-time refresh. So we have many capabilities that we can use in designing the digital environment. And we see these at work in the emerging digital scholarly forms that we're starting to feel familiar with. So what are some of the scholarly forms that are starting to emerge that have conventions to them, that use paratexts that we can read, that are legible, that are conventions? Well, we can read the wiki. It's actually a very well organized set of conventions. We know how to navigate it. We know what the hierarchies are telling us. We know what the graphical formats are cueing us in terms of how to read each section of a wiki page. There's not really a complexity here. We've come to understand it really quickly. In fact, if you start looking at this page and even think about what's in the menu bar and in the address bar and the search bar and so forth, it's a lot of possibilities that we've come to be able to ignore in order to focus. Other paratext environments, and again, these are new forms of paratext, are things like the tag clouds that get generated on LibraryThing. We didn't have tag clouds in a print environment. We don't have them in an analog environment. We have them in a digital environment. New form of paratext, okay? So again, what do we do with these? Where do they live? How do they work? And how do we, make them useful to us in the scholarship that we're doing? And in addition, of course, we have things like links, we have things like, postings and so forth. So this is all the new paratextual environment. If we go into isolated archives, we have slightly different issues because if we're working in something like the wiki or the LibraryThing, we're working in a networked browser-enabled environment. So it's filled with links and it's filled with porousness. It's not a silo. But if we go into any of the repositories that were built in sort of first-generation digital humanities, they're very much silos. They're sort of private repositories. It's like come into the Whitman Archive. In fact, the Whitman Archive, because it's integrated into the Library of Congress materials, the notebooks, does move you in and out of its site. But basically this here, the paratext, what is the paratext here? Well, almost everything is a paratext on this page in the sense that it is something to help you either navigate, understand what's there, present information, represent absent information, give you a sense of the references or the social mediation that's taking place. So if you look at things like published works or manuscripts or biography or criticism, resources, these are all categories of information represented to you in a place that tells you that they are that type of thing. And again, we take this for granted, but reanalyzing this to think about, oh, what are the new paratexts is really useful. We can move into the Walt Whitman Archive. Again, we see new kinds of paratexts here as well. The critical editing apparatus can be enabled by various kinds of electronic display so that we can encode different versions. We can watch Whitman's process at work. We can understand how the poem was produced, and we can take a look at the original in facsimile form. It's not an original. We know it's a facsimile. We know it's digitized, but still we're able to look at the facsimile of the original next to this transcription. These are all really amazing and remarkable, things that, again, now we start to take fully for granted. But we shouldn't take them for granted, again, because part of what we have to come to understand is how are we going to, do we want to conventionalize the graphical organization of these scholarly archives and materials in a way where the conventions start to be shared across these different projects, or we're going to let every project come up with its own set of conventions and that are more or less navigable to some extent. Well, if you start to go into older digital humanities projects, many of them are very difficult to navigate. A lot of them have a really, idiosyncratic interface, and a lot of the content modeling and work that went into them disappears because of the ultimate design and display. So again, even the intellectual work in the archives is not well served by a lot of those designs. Now, by contrast, you get into the electronic literature organization. There's a wonderful interface. It's really well designed. I think it's a wonderful interface. And, this is inconceivable, 15 years ago, that you would have a front page for a collection. Every single one of these is live. You move through it, you get a sense of it already, and it's an active interface to get you into each of these projects. And so, again, interesting concept of the paratext. Here we have, a way to display in miniature a whole set of properties and attributes of individual works that gives you a kind of, a little thumbnail glimpse, but it's alive. It's not a picture of something. It is a means of access. It's a live portal. It's a route into that particular project. So again, new kind of paratext. This is very different from a table of contents. It's visual, it's pictorial, it's grid-like, it doesn't have a hierarchy, and so all of these things are really interesting, I think, to think about. There are other kinds of forms of graphical display and visual display that are being generated out of structured data or unstructured data in order to give us a different kind of graphical interface or graphical analysis or data mining project that has a visual display. Many of them are things that are used to sort of do a wow factor for display of textual information of large corpora. One of the problems we have, and I'll talk about it again in a second, is scale. We've never had so much material that we want to get through and figure out its relationship to everything else that we want to get through as we do now. All right, so it's actually, increasingly a problem of a serious order. So, here we are. Text that was inserted, text that has survived. She's comparing two different editions of something. I forget. Does anybody know the Stephanie Posavec piece? And what is the text? Do you remember? It's the versions of, not Tale of Two Cities. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's a canonical text that she's working with. But, look at this display. All right, what does that fan shape mean? Somebody tell me? Anybody tell me what that fan shape means? Anybody tell me what this pretty little ginkgo leaf, pale blue ginkgo leaf display means? You can't, because it doesn't mean anything. What it means, it doesn't mean anything. It means that there is an algorithm that has processed some remediated information in order to generate a display that tells you something about the display. But it is not actually a very useful paratext in terms of the analysis. It's pretty, okay, I'm all for pretty. And so, someplace between the ugly, non-navigable, poor design of digital humanists who want to say, it doesn't matter, to the, very beautiful but not really related to actual tasks and content beauty of these experiments in graphical display, there needs to be a middle ground that's both beautiful and intellectually rich. So that's where we need to go with the graphical aspect, graphical design of the paratextual apparatus in digital space, in my opinion. Okay, so, it's just my opinion. All right, here's another one of, this is a more useful analysis, actually, the analysis of sentence length. These are still Posavec's work. I can't read what it is, but anyway, these are really interesting. There's a lot of experiments going on that data visualization and information flow, artists are working with that are really wonderful experiments that I think would be usefully matched with humanities projects. And I think that's another one of the interesting challenges at the moment. How do we get really talented form givers to actually work with humanists in a productive dialogue? Ben Fry, for instance, wonderful artist who's doing really smart stuff in relationship to digital humanities projects. Here's another project that I think doesn't work so well. It tells you something about the Old Testament. And this is a project that, again, large-scale corpus of materials sorted in some way according to something in order to help you navigate through something for some reason, exactly what and how. Again, the question of scale. We have such huge corpora. How are we going to navigate our way through them? You know, when you get into structures like these tree maps, it's like, what do these squares mean? Why do they have the shape they do? Why do they have the colors they do? In other words, we have a tremendously powerful apparatus at our disposal, and we haven't yet figured out how to link it to semantic values in analytic texts, though some people would argue, no, this is extremely useful in all kinds of ways. I have all kinds of arguments with the ways in which the algorithms and the data structure is reified in these pictures, but we won't go there. So we have a big problem. You know, this is our problem. This is the internet on steroids, right? This is, you know, your mind on the internet. Is basically, and it's like too much stuff all the time, so much traffic. Does this make sense? Can you read this? Does it do you any good? Where can you find any, you know, what do any of these nodes mean, right? And so human meaning has to be at a human scale. There has to be some way to mediate between large scale corpora of material and the human scale. And that's also part of the challenge of digital paratext and the design of humanistic interface. A project that is very successful, this is the last thing I'll show you before I show you Ivanhoe and Interpret, it's a project called Fockelgate. And this project was designed by Anne Burdick, a designer I think is really terrific, very smart in terms of thinking through the problems of graphical navigation and analysis. And this is, does anybody know this project here? Patrick, you know it. Okay, have you used it? Yeah. I think it's fantastic. All right, so what they did was they took all of Karl Kraus's 37 years, it's 30-something years, right, of his editing of this magazine Die Fackel. And it's the Viennese Academy of Sciences, is that right? I think so. Austrian Academy of Sciences that's behind this project. And, you know, so here's this great cultural figure, Karl Kraus. You may not know Karl Kraus, but Karl Kraus was to, you know, mid-century, you know, sort of 30s and 40s Vienna, like this towering figure of intellectual influence. Here's a troublemaker and a wit and a wag. And so part of what, but he had a lot of influence and a lot of visibility. So he edits this thing for 37 years. So the Austrian Academy of Sciences has a group of linguists who are very interested in figuring out how do the specific terms that Kraus is using come to have the meaning that they have. And in particular, he had a very idiosyncratic vocabulary when it came to insults. He used the word artist as an insult. Okay, so fair enough. So you're going to go through all of this, you know, digitized material. You're going to mark up all of the text. It's all transcribed. It's all marked up, all those little tags I was talking about throughout this text, so that you can figure out how much text do I need to understand when something is an insult and how it is an insult. Because again, from a linguistic point of view, this is a fascinating question. And it's not something you could do by hand. If you started now and read through every copy of Die Fackel, it would take you a while. And then, you know, how would you keep track of all the things you thought were insults? Where if you have a little army of people who have been working for, like, it took them like 15 years, I think, to digitize and mark up all of this. But it's been a huge project. But then how do you navigate this? Well, Anne Burdick came up with a really beautiful interface. I'm not going to dwell on it in great detail, but the search capabilities, the navigation of this entire corpus, the display of the facsimiles, as well as the transcriptions, ways of doing your search is the only German word I know is Wunderkind, so I used it to do my search. Right? It's like Schnitzel and Wunderkind. So anyway, to do a series of hits. The way the screen subdivides, opens up, keeps its navigational apparatus, you know where you are at any point in the corpus and can find your way. Is that fair to say? Do you find it useful, easy to navigate?
I've only used it a few times.
Yeah. I think it's a really skilled, I mean, it's a giant thing, but it is one thing. It's a closed and bounded environment. Again, it's a siloed environment. So you can indeed navigate your way through. It's all elaborately cross-referenced, so you can move from the word Wunderkind back to all the other places where Wunderkind appears, and so forth through the text. But ultimately, again, it's a closed environment. You can find your way through this archive. Is the electronic navigation ultimately more effective than the analog navigation. When I look at a bookshelf with this kind of array on it, I know where I am. I know what copy I've pulled out. I know where it sits in the years. I see the change of colors over the course of the editions. It's still, I think, very hard to replicate in a digital environment all of the embodied knowledge that we use to actually navigate the intellectual life that we live and the creative life that we live. But nonetheless, this is a stellar project in that regard. Okay, so a few years ago when I was at the University of Virginia, we decided we wanted to create a space for doing interpretation and doing collaborative interpretation. So we came up with a project called Ivanhoe. And Ivanhoe was going to be our way to revive our relationship to humanities work and to the classics. My colleague Jerome McGann said Ivanhoe is one of the great novels of the 19th century. Walter Scott is a fantastic writer. He gave me Ivanhoe to read. I went home, I read it, I thought this novel really stinks. Okay, I can't read it, I'm not interested, and Ivanhoe's a wimp. And he said, no, he is. Anybody read Ivanhoe lately? Okay, the anti-hero. He's always fainting. All right. So he said, no, you know, think about that wonderful scene where, you know, Rebecca's on the balcony with, you know, the villain, and this happens and this happens. And just think, what if he had, you know, picked her up and swept her off and they'd gone off and had this wild affair? And I said, but that's not what happens. He said, yes, but the audience that received Ivanhoe in the 19th century was very distraught with the way in which Scott actually finished the book and decided to do a lot of rewriting of Ivanhoe. So fans of Ivanhoe were doing rewrites of Ivanhoe in the 19th century, okay, in order to change the ending, fan culture. All right, so he said, why don't we do this? So intervening in the text, rewriting the text, we'll do this. So we designed a project called Ivanhoe that became a platform for doing interpretive work. Well, what's interpretive work going to look like? This was my drawing of what my desktop looks like in my brain. You got all these pages, got all these things arranged, you're making all kinds of connections, all those squiggle lines are connections. And we decided, oh, we're going to make an environment for doing that kind of work, and it'll be electronic. And we'll design an interface where you can do what, you know, all of the, that's little Ivanhoe climbing the eye to enlightenment there on the upper left. That be actually copied from a medieval illumination. And so, you know, you want to bring in a text, and you want to be able to edit it, and you want to be able to do things. We made it a role-playing game. And we said, you know, whenever you're doing interpretation or scholarly work, you're actually a persona. You're playing a role. You're not just doing it. You have to reflect on who you are, what you're doing, where you're coming from. So we began to design Ivanhoe. And I did it in these little PowerPoint slides, like my favorite way to design things. Little storyboards. Here's how you would work in Ivanhoe. You'd have the text. You'd start to edit. You'd have a theater where you could go in and role play. You'd have a cafe where you could meet and schmooze with your fellow players. And then we decided to try to play with the third dimension as well as a desktop environment. And we had a whole theoretical apparatus. We said, you know, after all, we studied critical theory for 25 years. Some of that should show up in the way we think about designing these things. You don't just have a text. You have a discourse portal. You don't just, you know, take any text at all. You have to call a text into being. So we did all that sort of thing. And again, continue to sketch the ways in which we would work in an Ivanhoe environment. And ultimately, we got, thanks to Jerome McGann, got a major Mellon Lifetime Award. And so we were actually able to build Ivanhoe and to build an environment where actually we could have many people working on the same text, intervening in it, rewriting, commenting on each other's rewriting, commenting on each other's comments, marking up any part of the text we wanted to, bringing in other documents, and linking the entire conversation in such a way that the underneath, the under the hood, recorded all the versions from anybody's point of view. This is a massive undertaking. And the final interface of Ivanhoe, which you kind of see here, was a large rim in which the, this was the major interface, allowed you to actually see the course of the gameplay. And if you clicked on any of the, there's players in the upper right. If you clicked on the players, you'd see the game from their point of view. You could move along the bottom along a slider and see the progression of the game as people added their comments and their texts and so forth. You'd see the center of the game move and shift according to where interest lay. So it really was, you know, about the social production of interpretation. We use it for teaching. We use it for classes. We use it for actual work. And again, the infrastructure was terrific. But this interface left me somewhat dissatisfied. I still wanted to be able to work like this in some ways, because I'm a document-based, you know, old-time person. And so having this interface really felt frustrating. So when Ivanhoe came to its place of functionality and fruition, I started to think beyond Ivanhoe and to imagine that I might make something I called Interpret, Ivanhoe 2.0. That would take a lot of the functionalities that we built in Ivanhoe and then extend it also into the web. Ivanhoe was a downloadable app. Our materials were stored on a server, so basically you logged in and you did your work and uploaded it to the server whenever you would publish what you were doing, but it didn't connect all that well with the web. So I thought Interpret needs to work in the web. That's where we do researching. We want to be able to write, want to be able to publish, work in a networked environment, and generate various kinds of displays. So I started designing Interpret, and I wanted it to be able to produce nice, clean output that was published. This was a real project I was working on, which was this Petit Journal des Réfugiés, 1896, Gillette Burgess publication on wallpaper from Bohemia in San Francisco. And to think, how do we actually, write in this environment? How would we do research? So I designed this thing. You can kind of see at the top, there's a navigational menu bar. There's projects, dates, you log in, you create an index, you do various kinds of searches, and all of that work starts to be recorded. This is before Omeka was really even on the radar, and even before Zotero started to come along. Because I started designing this in about 2005 and 6, and that's about the time that Omeka and Zotero were coming along. And then I worked on it through 2008. But basically, what I was trying to do here was to make a very clean interface in which writing could be done by a variety of people, whose initials are indicated here, simultaneously working to interpret a particular text, and each bringing their own materials and commentary into play, as we did in Ivanhoe. And that you could go online and you would be able to collect materials and quote and cite and keep your information trail the way that we now do with Zotero, but at the time that didn't exist. And this was a kind of early version of Zotero, kind of emulated here to show the way in which somebody might be working and keeping track of what it is that they were doing while they're gathering materials online to bring into their argument. You might want to structure your argument graphically and visually with materials you had captured from in the web. You might want to be able to be commenting while other people are commenting on your comments, because you might be, writing about the graphical organization of this, and somebody else might be writing about the literary aspect, and somebody else might be writing about fashion, somebody else might be writing about the publishing context. And so many different dimensions of the text could all be written about. Again, everybody might be organizing their materials differently. I'm a believer that visual organization makes an argument. And then, you continue to do this discussion and debate, and then have these many arrays of all of the information that you've gathered that can be sorted and searched and found through any point on the text. And ultimately, you're going to want to bring this into a published form by being able to move through a sequence of, of things that are not necessarily linear. You might have a linear argument, but you might have dimensions that spread out and links that bring that argument onto the page in order to let you talk about, this from many different points of view. So this is a kind of sketch of what that might look like in the behind the scenes, that you ultimately have something that could be published in a web format as well as in a print on demand output, so it looks very book-like. But behind that are all these information structures and arrays that can be accessed through a search. So this was the fantasy of Interpret, right? And that print-on-demand output would look like this. So we're sort of back to our beautiful bibliographical paratexts, but underneath it is this kind of information space. So I got to that point, and I gave it up. And I gave it up because I realized it was completely misconceived, and that the idea of making a standalone environment that could do all of these things doesn't make sense. That instead what you want is a series of apps, like iPhone apps, for doing scholarship. You want scholarly iPhone apps. You want to be able to have a GIS application, you want a timeline application, you want a footnote application, you want a a commentary application. You want to be able to pull these things together and make them interoperable. And I think that's much more where we are at the moment. It's like Omeka's doing really fabulous things. There are all kinds of plugins, the ways it works with Zotero. After talking with James Asher yesterday, I said there's ways it can work with Tinderbox and Stretch Text and these other wonderful tools. So rather than a single environment that locks us into a platform that's a software application, what we really want is to be able to enable as a community these different kinds of functionalities and make them talk really well to each other and generate multiple output streams. So much as I was fond of Interpret in certain kinds of ways, I'm happy to let it go. And all I did was draw a lot of pictures of it anyway. And we didn't build any of it. We did build Ivanhoe. So with that said, I'm going to spend just 2 more minutes showing you this other project, which is the one in which I just want to be able to write from my own archive and create a database archive and do a project that's a silo project. And this is what a project that I call All, modestly. Okay, so this is a real project because I have a lot of books I wrote and never published. You would think there's enough Johanna Drucker books already out there, but no, there's about 250 other books that didn't get published. So I'm interested in sort of doing a database of them and starting to think about what they are. And I'm thinking, okay, so what are the things I can do electronically? How do I want to work with this database and this archive? Well, one thing is I want to have multiple tables of contents. You know, that seems like a no-brainer. Like, you want a lot of different tables of contents. You don't just want one. You might want it according to period and type. You might want it according to place and location. You might want, to sort things at different levels of granularity, so you can see all the different things that you did in a particular time period, down to, degrees of detail. You might want to be able to cross-reference by title and by date, right? So that you'd sort, the titles of things and the dates of them, so that you can cross-reference. Again, this is how do we, use the affordances of the electronic to, write our own work, all right? And I want it to be pretty, all right? So I'm like for pretty, right? Simple, clean, clear, pretty. Why not? Things don't actually have to be ugly. Okay. You might want to begin to, annotate. So the endless kind of annotations, like here is a short description of this particular set of texts. So, and I might want to be able to enter an index at any point by finding a word like real accounts, things that are, based on the real. So I want to click index, and I want to find all the real accounts. And then I open up in the same page. This is why I really like stretch text. In the same screen. I don't go to the index. The idea that you go somewhere is an old book notion. But on the screen, it's all about refresh and redraw and the allocation of space and the readjustment. So I want to go see all the real accounts that I've written. So again, it's this, cross-referenced index. And, I might want to write a kind of overview text, that kind of moves me through as a narrative. I might want to write 5 different overview texts, some of them complete fictions, right? Total lies about myself and my life. Why not? I might want to be able to use semantic web and topic map type navigation devices to pull out a particular set of keywords like the word navigation, okay? And here at navigation, and what is it close to in a kind of tag cloud semantic web sense, and then navigate in this particular mode. So again, what do we have that we can use? These are new forms of digital paratext. So I might again then want to, I've got this set of things. Well, of course, you're going to pick erotic tales. You're going to go look at indices? Girl stories? No, you're going to go to the erotic tales. So what are the erotic tales? So I want to go through and start reading the erotic tales, okay, and see what they are. So again, it's this way to reconfigure, repurpose, reorganize through a paratextual apparatus that again is really fully digital, but doesn't necessarily leave the conventions of print behind. And again, lets you move in various ways, and then you might want to actually look at the originals. Here's like my first full novel written in 1964. It's this little handwritten thing, right? And the whole sort of tale of the thing, and you might want to actually transcribe some of this or make comments on it. Here's a transcription of it, right? Here's a gloss about it. Here's a narrative about it. So that again, what are the ways you're going to move through? You have these little markers, tiny tags that say this is the beginning. You can move that along. So what's the least amount you need to navigate elegantly in any environment? And then ultimately for me, because I'm still attached to print output, because it doesn't need batteries and it'll last, and it won't go obsolete, is to be able to generate print on demand from the same material. So so at the moment I'm working on 2 projects. This database of my own obsessive compulsive existence, and the other, a project called the Museum of Writing, where we're really trying to use the scholarly tools that are out there. So both of these are trying to do the same thing, but one is very much a private writing project, a creative writing project, and the other is really a scholarly environment, but they're going to use the same kinds of tools in interaction with each other to take advantage of what I think of as the current state of digital paratextual apparatus to do the kind of work that I want to do. So I'm going to stop there and see what kind of questions or comments you might have.
Why is it so hard to get, you think about these formal qualities or the question of interface and these things. Why is it so hard to get other people, or my sense is that the general public does not think about how the information is arranged online or in books for that matter,
right,
on the level you're thinking. But why, when the Gap changes its logo, everybody gets bent out of shape, or last year Tropicana changed its juice carton and everybody said, I can't find it in the store, what am I going to do? These seem inconsequential compared to the kind of power that the internet has or a book has to channel our modes of thought and thinking. Why do we think of one term and not another? Or
yeah, you raise a really good point. I think that brands are so recognizable as logo icons, and they were designed to be that way. And brand loyalty, you feel betrayed when the face of the other changes. What are you doing to me? Yesterday yesterday you had glasses, and today you had LASIK surgery, and I loved you with glasses. So we have this proprietary relationship to brands, but I just think that we haven't had a when you think about the fact that up until really 1984, for the most part, graphic design was the provenance of highly skilled specialists in a field for which they had been trained, and that even the field of graphic design only comes into being in the 20th century as an identified field. Before that, it's simply part of the profession of the printing room floor. And so the notion that there's a kind of theoretical set of epistemological underpinnings to the organization of knowledge is something that has a history in the information field. But even that is really pretty much 20th century. Not entirely, because people like Lull and so forth go back, Lull, Ramus, and others go back much earlier. But I just think we haven't, the general public has not had to grapple with this or felt empowered to grapple with it, because most of what they receive is produced according to formulas that were part of a fairly guild-like professional community. But now that so many people can make work, like anybody can be a publisher, which we know isn't true. But there's still the means of production are more and more available. So the capacity to make major mistakes is more and more available, and that's useful, right? But it shows us that we need a language for talking. I think we need more language for talking about the way in which graphic organization structures knowledge and is integral to it than we used to. And people are just becoming more aware, I think, than they were. So in fact, if you had Kenny Day just go ahead and design the New York Times online for a couple days running, I think you'd get as much uproar as you did over the Tropicana brand or the Gap change of typeface. And people would say, what is this? It's incomprehensible. And you say, well, it's just, and this is the argument I have with my English, my literary colleagues all the time. It's like, they say, well, it doesn't matter what typeface something is printed in. It really, it doesn't matter. And then I say, okay, so let's just take, sonnets from the Portuguese and print it in black letter. And they, well, they're horrified. We wouldn't do that, right? Or, it's like take Rilke's, poetry and put it in cartoon type. Put it in hobo. It's like, exactly. And then they say, oh, you're just being silly. And I said, no, this is the point. It's like showing up in the wrong clothes, or the right, but it's a deliberate act. So I just think there wasn't that much education about design, and design has not been a big part of the digital humanities community, and I think to its detriment. Just as humanistic training hasn't been that much a part of the design community, to its detriment. So this is a really good moment to form teams of people who can work together and bring their disciplinary expertise into dialogues that produce a much richer approach. You can't do this stuff by yourself. You know, you can draw pictures of it in PowerPoint like I do. Just make pictures. But to actually build things, you need a group of people. You need people whose expertise is so deep in an area that you can only have a superficial knowledge of. So I don't know, what do you think?
I mean, the educational aspect seems, I mean, that's the problem. And I wind up saying this no matter what class I'm engaged with, that, you know, that we learn to read in a certain way, and we never learn to watch movies. We never learn to read advertising. These are 101 things that we talk about all the time, and we never actually create those departments or those classes that actually do it. But yeah, I think you're right that people would be outraged if the New York Times changed tomorrow. And when it changed its typeface a few years ago, there was, I mean, it was minor, but there was some, like, what the heck is going on? But it's not so much those established things. I understand why that people are, you know, believe in the conventions as if they're truth. But there's conventions that went out like, we know Google's not evil because look how simple it is. It's just a Google and with a box, and that's it. And it can't possibly be bad. And I think Yahoo, you go there and it's like, oh my God, there's stuff everywhere. And it's not. I don't search for the Yahoo because I believe Google is giving me the truth because it's so simple.
Right.
and some people we don't engage with that. We don't think about that convention that's being established.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's, you know, it's semiotics 101. You know, it's ideology 101. And it's really important. It's like, you know, in whose interest is that ease? In whose interest is that transparency? How does that work? How does that organize our relationship to our understanding of the cost, the labor, you know, the ecological impact, you know, all of those things. But, you know, on a more even, you know, another just really basic level, even if you don't want to get into all that, it's just, you know, how does the knowledge that we produce and consume come to us in a form that actually constitutes the knowledge itself? It's not a container. It is the knowledge. It constitutes, you know, constitutes it. It's rhetorical. It's argumentative. You know, it's part of the. It's sort of proto-semantic. It's pre-semantic. It's quasi-semantic, but it's certainly rhetorical. The way in which graphic information helps to structure argument. So I think, yeah.
What is the function of the speed at which our lives are moving in information? I know recently my long-term grocery store is in the 6-month remodeling phase. Things are moving constantly, and it drives me nuts because I'm used to almost going to the store blind and picking things because I knew where everything was. I knew what the logo looked like. You know, there's a lot of our lives that we're using that little bit of information, and we're not really paying attention to it. So what's the relationship of speed?
Right. Well, when the people in the grocery store rearrange the aisles so that you don't know where you are, they're doing it so that you encounter products that you don't know you need. Okay. So that's why they're doing it. That's called supermarket design. All right, supermarket engineering, and they have a whole science of it, and they do it on purpose. Okay, so you know, last week you knew where the coffee beans were. This week it's like, oh my God, they moved them to the deli. Why?
You have to ask someone for it.
I know. So that's the purpose of that, and the rate at which they're doing it has to do with the pressure for shelf space, you know, in those environments. But you know, the rest of the speed is the, you know, it's the speed of market-driven forces, you know, pushing consumption to a great extent.
But doesn't it play in with the interface with this sort of thing too? I mean, I know my 20-something-year-old nephew, the way he navigates through web pages is just dizzying to me.
Right.
You know,
oh yeah.
It's a whole different construct.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, you know, they're the born digital natives, you know, who are able to navigate very fluently because, you know, that's the environment that they're familiar with, and they grow up in it, and you know, that's just going to be a fact, you know, of life. But I don't know. I teach letterpress printing, and we kept joking we're going to start the slow technology movement. You know, it's like the slow food movement. You know, and students love it. They come into the shop, and you know, it's a completely different world, and time has a different form in there, and it's like you start focusing, and hours go by, but you've only set this much type, and it's very congenial, and it's very kind of so. You know, carving out space from all of that insanity is part of the challenge for sure. But I'm sorry to have to tell you, your grocery store is going to continue to go through reorganization. I know. It's cruel, but true. So, yes?
My background is in human-computer interface, which is the same thing you're talking about, but I only discovered this today because I never really heard of your field before. So it seems to me there's room for a lot of cross-fertilization because the terms that you use aren't the ones that I'm familiar with.
Right.
And I think that it's not that just you're using different terms to mean the same thing. There's some different concepts.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like a really rich way to your people in your field and people in the human-computer interface field would understand each other almost immediately, but they aren't talking, so it would be like sort of just a high bandwidth way to do some cross-disciplinary work, I think.
I agree, yeah.
So for instance, in computer science, they talk about things like semantic networks. And you didn't use that word, but a lot of your stuff has to do with semantic networks.
Right.
And they have this notion of an information lens. And the thing with looked like ginkgo leaves reminded me of an information lens, except the information lens actually seems useful because as it's like your eyeball is really close to the paper, so everything near to you is with a lot of detail, and everything far away is much less detail represented, but it's completely interactive. So as you move your eye, so to speak, via the mouse cursor, kind of new worlds open up as you leave old ones. And you get to see a lot of high-level interrelationships. And there's several other things like that.
Yeah, no, your point is very well taken, and I actually read a lot of HCI stuff, and I've read a lot of basic interface design principles, and I follow that field. But I think you're right that it's not just that I'm using different words. I'm actually interested in what I call humanistic interface, which is different than what the HCI community is aiming at, because they are so, and rightly so for the purposes for which they're working, but they're really interested in efficiency, they're interested in reward systems, they're interested, and a lot of really interesting theoretical work in that area about the difference between, do you show an information structure and let a user figure out how to do it, or do you think about what a user wants to do and then let the information structure match on to that? And I mean, really interesting things in that world, but it's true that my agenda is somewhat different, and that I was shocked to find, and maybe this isn't really true, but somebody told me last week that there is nobody in the computer science department at UCLA who is an HCI person.
Here?
At UCLA. There's no HCI people. Nobody does interface. And it's like, how can that be? How can there be nobody who does interface? And it just seems inconceivable.
Just to disagree with you a tiny bit, I think that the HCI agenda is closer to your agenda than I feel like
No, again, I don't disagree with you. And again, the question is how to formulate the dialogue and sort of move that conversation a little bit away from some of the tenets of belief that are so central to the HCI. I mean, again, I've learned tons from reading that material, but there are some things that I sort of fundamentally don't agree with from a humanistic perspective, but that's fine.
Is there, can you suggest a hub where we can kind of find these experiments, like experiments in navigational design and
There's a bunch of good data visualization and information visualization portals that show, new visualization, like where Stephanie Posavec's work is. If you Google information visualization, data visualization, you'll tap into that particular, rich mine of things. Off the top, I should know them all. And I apologize for not putting attributions on these slides. I'm really sorry. They should have attributions, and I just, for various reasons, didn't get to it. But it's really interesting stuff, and I love what Stephanie Posavec's doing. Don't get me wrong. Again, somebody has to do these kinds of experiments if we're going to start to explore imaginatively what the new possibilities are. So I'm so glad that somebody with her aesthetic sensibility is doing this. But I still think we have room for a really interesting connection to be made between what we want to do and what these folks are producing as innovative form.
Right.
Could I suggest?
Yeah.
The processing webpage is one of the
Processing is, yeah. Good idea. Processing is a really good one. But there's stuff that's not built in processing that's really interesting as well. But processing is a great place to start. That's great.
I was looking more for like actual user interface navigational experiments.
Mm-hmm.
Like I understand processing kind of maps data, but I'm looking more for like experiments in user interface design.
Right.
Which were
Well, you know, if you look at human-computer interface, if you do human-computer interface, you'll get to Ben Shneiderman, and you can read through Ben Schneiderman's work. You can read through the work of Jock McKinley and Stuart Card. I mean, these are major, figures in this world. Look at the information visualization. Look at Stephen Krug, Common Sense. You start, if you start Googling interface, most of the classics of interface design, Jesse James Garrett, that stuff will start to come up. Are there references that you would add into that as far as classics?
Yeah, there's a couple, and the name of Jacob Nielsen.
Jacob Nielsen, yeah, Jacob Nielsen, Ben Shneiderman, Jacob Nielsen, Jesse James Garrett. These are major figures in the world of interface design. And again, it's a really interesting history. I mean, you start with Douglas Engelbart and Ivan Sutherland, and start thinking about interface. And Myron Kruger, my favorite, an artist. But it's a very interesting history to think about what our relationship to the machines is. There's a lot of good theory in this world as well. Matthew Fuller's Blip has a nice introduction to interface. Brenda Laurel's work is really an interesting intro to interface. So, you can get to it from the theory side of new media studies, and you can get to it from the HCI community side as well. So those would be good start points for that.
Yeah, so you talked about how designing these new paratextual interfaces requires a group, right? And that, conceptually I could play around with designs too, but I don't know how to actually build these things. Who are these people? How do you find them? How do you find them? What skills do you need to look for in a group to help you do this kind of work?
Right, and that's a good set of questions. And what you want is a web developer who understands the life cycle of the production of the materials you're trying to work with. Do you want to build a repository? If you're going to build a repository, then you need somebody who's going to give you a content management system and understands what's the current state of content management systems. That's basically the shelving. It's the real nuts and bolts of how you're going to create file types and put them into some kind of classification system, storage system, so they can be accessed and used. And what kind of server environment are they going to live in, and so forth. What are the file types, or the sizes? So, you need content management. And then you need somebody who's going to help you with the web development part of this, and who's going to understand a lot of things that James understands, for instance, which is, and I keep pointing at James here, but it's like, are you working with a database to keep your metadata and access? Do you want to have marked up text? Do they live in the database? So it has to do, what kind of materials are you working with? You're working with multimedia materials, audio files, video files. How do you want those to be displayed? Do you want to have, time stamps on them so that you can point to certain clips within those? Or are you taking excerpts from them? Are you going to do a facsimile of an entire book, or just a few pages of it? You transcribing it? So those are all the things that have to do with repository building, but also have to do with helping you figure out what the file formats are for working in a web environment. If you're authoring in a multimedia environment, you might want to use something like Vectors is developing at USC called Scalar. It's meant for authoring in multimedia materials, or you might want to use HTML5. So, but the problem is, where do you go to find that out? How can you go down to your campus store and get, Web Scholar, for Web Scholar 2.0? And you can't at the moment. It's still a bit there's still a gap between the desire that people have to work in this environment, and it's still a little bit specialized skill that you need to get over that bridge. So you know, what we need are environments in institutions like this that let you walk in and say, well, I want to do this, I want to make that, and you begin to piece it together bit by bit. You say, oh, so if I'm going to do a repository, I'll start with this, I'll start with my scanning, I'll use this content management system. You know, there's plenty of content management systems, but you're not going to learn about that. You want somebody who knows what they are and how to use them, help you analyze your project, and present with you a generalizable solution. So what you're asking for is something that's really important, because we all want this, which is we want some kind of unit in our environment that helps us to get over the threshold to introduce you to analyze your project and problem and show you what are the steps you need to go through to do it. Because they're not hard, but knowing what to do and knowing what's out there is daunting, because you start reading the technical specs of things, you go, oh, they need me to do this and this and this, and it has to be in this and this and this, and it's like, I don't know what those words mean. And I don't know who is the person in charge of knowing what those words mean in my campus. So I think, you know, the fact that you're asking for this, well, are you a grad student?
I am.
And what is the project you're interested in doing?
I know how to TI and code, and do a little XSLT, but I am working on an archive of Anne Radcliffe's works.
Yeah.
And I'm just in the early stages of trying to envision how to present it, how to organize it, what do I want to do with that organization, what do I want to do with markup. Right. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, obviously I can't do this alone. Who do I need and where do I find these people?
Okay, so one of the things you might think about is going to a THAT camp. Do you know what THAT camp is? T-H-A-T?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So that's a place to share knowledge and exchange. And I would say if you're interested in doing an archive of Anne Radcliffe, take a look at the archives that are out there that work really well and think about, okay, if I were going to build it, like I just found Allison Booth has just done a project at UVA, was not just, she's been working on it for a while, on comparative bibliographies of distinguished women. And it doesn't look very pretty, it doesn't have a very good skin on it, but it's really nicely designed. And so it's like, oh, I want to be able to do this with my bibliography. So I said to one of my friends who's a tech person, how hard would it be to reverse engineer this? Like, what's behind this? Tell me what's behind it. You know, how hard is the DTD for this? You know, how difficult would it be? She said, it's not very hard. And then I wrote to Allison and I said, I'm really interested in this. Would you be willing to share the DTD so I could repurpose it? And she said, sure, the DTD is online. You know, you can go here and download it. So, you know, forming that camp will allow you to form some of those kinds of networks of communication. But, you know, most digital scholars are pretty open. If you find the kind of archive that you think does the things you want it to do, be in touch with them. Most of these archives don't have as much documentation as we would like, but some do. And they tell you how they built it, and they tell you what the technical specs are. You learn to you know, figure that out. And then you think, well, okay, you know, what about this would be able to be repurposed for my work? And that's a good place to start, because then you're seeing what the functionality is, you're seeing what the design is from the organization of activities and information. And then you can take that to somebody and say, well, what do I, especially if you already know TI and a little bit of XSL, you know, you already have a leg up. So, you know, yeah, sure, yeah.
I was going to put in a plug and then ask a specific question about this. So the plug, if you're students here, I want to put in a plug for Asset, which actually is the little sign that's behind the. I direct a program that it serves arts and sciences, and we also partner with other places on campus. And our objective is to help support the use of technology in teaching and learning. So, you know, drop us a line, and we have staff who are able to help broker or help put things together. And one of the things that we're addressing is this issue of lowering the threshold for accessibility. We're doing that now with, there are content management platforms out there that make that easy to do. We're using Joomla and WordPress, for example, as our examples. But what you're talking about is an infrastructure that's in a different design purpose than something like Joomla or WordPress are. What might be
you can do a lot with those.
Oh, sure you can, sure. But I was wondering if you're aware of an infrastructure, or if we just hypothesize that you wanted to build an infrastructure that was more directed toward the kind of collaboration and dialogue and processes rather than content management, right?
Yeah.
In this sense,
Yeah.
publishing kind of thing. What would be the essential widgets there? What would be the essential plugins to that kind of environment, to that kind of infrastructure?
Right. I mean, we've been talking about this quite a bit because of Museum of Writing. We're just trying to think about how do we want to design an environment for collaborative scholarship. And so some of that is some of what we built into Ivanhoe, which is the ability to have various versions of documents, to have multiple scholars writing and commenting on the documents, to be able to manage that and somewhat sort and manage that, conversation flow, because it's not going to be linear, it's going to be multidimensional in many ways.
Do you think those are widgets, or do you think that those are built into the overall functionality? That was one of the things I was looking at here is it still seems as if some of the infrastructure that you're building is multifunctional, but it's still heavyweight, rather than modular and widget-based.
That's true.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, annotation software could be widget-based. Commentary, references, bibliography, that could be widget-based. But if you're going to make a social environment that allows certain kinds of cross-referencing of materials that are sharing a repository in some sense, whether it's a virtual sharing or an actual sharing, at the level of the repository they're working as one repository, then the question is what is the environment in which that can happen, and how can you build an interpretive scrim that allows you to use materials across different repositories as if they are virtually one. And that's pretty much what we're trying to figure out.
It's an interesting difference.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to figure out. So, but there's more and more really great widgets, and there's a wonderful community of developers who are actually trying to push this. I don't want to be that person. I'm not going to be a tool builder. I'm going to try to build a thing, this Museum of Writing project, which I didn't talk about, but you can kind of get what it is. And I'm working with folks in London and at King's and University of London, and build a real thing and then see what do we need to do that thing, rather than building a platform so that I can do various things. Even when I was designing Interpret or Ivanhoe, we used it to do real things. We didn't try to design a platform in the ether. It's like, okay, what if I was really working with Petit Journal des Refugiés and I want to do this kind of a project? Then, in the storyboard, it's like, now I want to do this thing. Not, how do I build software as if it can do all kinds of things, but I don't know if I'll ever use them. So I think that, for me, the way I learned to think about the design process was from actually walking through things I actually want to do, right? User experience, like modeling the user experience, I believe, sort of user scenarios, I think is the way that you think about it. I think we're going to have to stop because I need to go, but thank you all very much for your attention.